Good morning, students of topics in British and American culture. Last week we did the orientation, and so now we are going to sort of do an introduction to the material itself. Like I said to you, the plan is to try and do a Zoom lecture next week. We will also be having our first quiz shortly after I finish talking about the first section, which is basically it corresponds to chapter 1. That should probably take us 3 classes to deal with. And then on the Thursday, a week from this Thursday, we will have our first quiz. We'll be setting that up on Google Forms. The Zoom lecture will be interesting because I've never had more than 22 people on Zoom, I think, and this class has 54. According to Zoom's description, we can have 100 people in a Zoom meeting at once. So this should be interesting. Obviously, I'm going to have to mute everyone, but the point is that there will be some interaction between us, and you will get to watch me speak live as if I'm a real person, and I'm not editing or changing anything, although I really don't edit very much, just add some graphics and maybe cut the ends a little bit. But other than that, it's just going to be like now, except for you're going to have a chance to be there and participate in real time. So hopefully it'll give you more of a sense that you're actually being active in the class. That's the idea. We will do that after we do the quiz, because I'm going to plan the quiz to do to start the quiz at 10 a.m. and then have the Zoom lecture probably 11. So after the forums have been completed, so everything will be done during the normal Thursday time slot. More on that later this week, okay? So here we are. I hope you've gotten the book. This is the one that you have to follow along in. Today I'm just going to talk about a few things about the course in general first, before we get into the details of British and American culture itself. So I think the first question that has to be answered is, why take this class in the beginning in the first place? And why start this class all the way back thousands of years ago the way I do? Well, that's probably because I consider this class an introduction to British and American culture. So we're trying to cover all of it from the beginning until now in order to give you maximum exposure to all the different aspects of British and American culture. That's why I interpreted topics in British and American culture to mean that if this class gets taught by a different professor, they may approach it a different way. But my concept of the class is that after you take this class, you should have a sample of everything from the beginning to the end. The most important things from my experience, knowledge, and from my perspective. There are other things that will be left out, no doubt. But these are the things that I consider sort of basic building blocks of what American and British culture represent. So we're going to start way back at antiquity, an ancient classical period when Romans are colonizing the British Isles, long before America even is imagined by anyone. So nobody even knows it's there at this point. So that's why British culture will come first in the class. And the class will proceed sort of in a chronological way, according to time, because that's the best way to organize it, to bring us back to the present. As we get closer to now, to 2020, there are going to be links between ideas, and the class will go sort of forward and then go back and reference things that happen in different orders. But at the beginning, it's just going to be in order of time. So it's not a history course, like I said, but there is a lot of history involved because, as one of my good history major friends, I'm not a history major, I'm a history enthusiast. One of my friends who is a history major said to me, history is the study of everything, because everything is history. And you can't argue with that. This is a story, right? This is a story of groups of people, not just one group of people. A culture is not one group. It is a composition of many different groups of people, and their contributions together give us this idea of a national culture eventually. But as everybody knows, there were no nations hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago. There were empires and there were kingdoms and different types of states. There were city-states, but there were no nations. And this is something, there are many things that you have to understand about this course. And I think one of the great things about this course is that when we talk about a group of people that may be genetically related to us or geographically in the same spot and not related to us closely, but we have a sense that we are part of something together, that you can try and understand what it was like for them, right? The people who live in Korea right now, the Koreans, they are a composition of many different ethnic groups. People have moved, come and gone, been conquered, lived and died, created things and lost things. And now Korea is the result. The same goes for the United Kingdom, Great Britain, the British people. They are spread all over the world now, but there is a place where they originated. And the people that are all over the world, including me, my ancestors were British, different. I mean, they were Welsh and Scottish. They were part of this identity we call British. So these are all things that we are very interesting that you don't know unless you study, unless you learn about it. And once you do know, I think one of the most valuable things about the course is that once you do know, you say, oh, that I see it now. That makes sense. We have not been doing that for no reason. And it's not that we just started doing it. You know, people have been doing that in this place for, in some cases, hundreds, if not thousands of years. So we're going to talk about all these things, especially the first week is going to focus on what I call the first millennium. It's not just the first millennium, it sort of goes back past that, and it continues, you know, into, you know, the second millennium. But generally I just say, okay, the first week of the class, the first topic is about the first 1,000 years from the Roman occupation until the Norman invasion. So it's roughly from Julius Caesar in just before 0 AD and the invasion of England by William the Conqueror just after 1000 AD. And I mean just after by about 50 years. That's just after in this period of time that we're talking about. So culture is always in flux. Culture is always changing, and we always retrieve things from our past and we use them and we apply them in new ways. But a lot of the things that you think may be brand new, technology, of course, is one of those things. It is new. It's different than anything that our ancestors ever experienced. But you will notice, if you pay attention, that the things that our ancestors knew and understood and used, we transform them and change them and put them, you know, into new media and locations, and we use them, we just represent them in different ways. Digital content, a lot of it is not new. It's been written or it's been painted or it's been created years ago. And just because we put it on the internet and we digitize it and share it and spread it on the internet doesn't mean that it's a completely new thing. So there's all kinds of connections between us and our past, which we need to try and understand. So this is one of the most important things of the course, and one of the reasons why I love it. It is a lot of material, and you will at some points be overwhelmed. I will try to give you main points for you to study, but I want to tell you the details and I want to tell you the big picture. So if you miss a few things as we go, don't stress about it. The book is very detailed. It's 300 pages long. You don't need to know every word of it. You just need to know the things I emphasize. So there's going to be things on this board soon. There are going to be things in this book. There are going to be things on the website. And if you follow all of them and you pay attention to the important things, you won't have to worry about your grade. I'm mostly concerned about how well you know the material, and after this course that you don't forget it and you learn how to apply it and use it in your own life. When you go back home to wherever home is, or if your home is here, my home is kind of Korea and Canada, I can apply these ideas here or there or anywhere. So, like I said, culture is always changing. Some cultures are more revolutionary than others, and we'll be talking about that too. Generally, British culture is quite conservative, and that's one of the things that we're going to stress very soon, is that it hasn't really changed as much as you think. We always look at British culture, especially for developing countries or countries that followed them technologically or politically and did things differently. Socially, you might consider the British, at least at one point, one of the most developed, advanced cultures in the world. But they did it very slowly in a lot of ways. And some of the things that you think are like democracy and representation and natural rights and justice and stuff, it's not really that much better or different now than it was hundreds of years ago. These are old systems. And I think that's true of America too. America is a much more revolutionary state. It's much newer and larger and in some ways more complicated than the United Kingdom. It's certainly also conservative, but it has a lot more active resistance, and it rises up against itself. It's had recent wars with itself, and there's always this internal conflict, it seems, with the United States, which isn't really as apparent in the United Kingdom, except for the division between the Scottish and the English, or the English and the Irish, or the Welsh and the Scottish and the English, because those are distinct, states that existed in the past and were absorbed. But America is not like that. America, from the very beginning, was one and separate at the same time. So how do we understand these complicated places, these cultures that have so many different things? Usually at this point in the lecture, the first lecture especially, or the second lecture, I look at my students, and I have no students to look at. I just have a messy room off screen to look at. But I look at my students and I say, what is culture anyway? And I get various answers, and there's really no wrong answer, because it's everything that is a part of human life. And there are cultures of very small groups, and there are enormous cultures like the ones that we're talking about here. We have international culture, and we have national culture, and we have small regional cultures, and we also have family culture, for example, and we have youth culture. There's so many different ways of dividing it. So it's hard to choose what to talk about when you talk about Britishness or Americanness. When it comes to the British, I think when I ask things, there seems to be more of a blank stare. Like, what do you mean? Give me an example of British culture. And they're like, well, I get answers like umbrellas, because it's always raining there, and fish and chips, because everybody knows about that food, which I find delicious, but some people think is not a good example of a national food per se. That's not really a great achievement. I'm on the side of fish and chips is fantastic, and I would eat it every Friday, but lots of people put it down. It's become sort of symbolic of British. Rain, umbrellas. Sometimes they say manners, right? Inevitably a Korean guy says soccer, or what they call football, English football, because there's been Korean players, especially the currently Son Heung-min, fantastic player, and he plays there, and so those things come up. Why do they come up? Because those are the things that people, those are the things that get focused on in the media, so that's what people pick up on. Americanness gets a lot people answer the American identity question much faster. Some things are good, some things are bad. They say things like New York, the Statue of Liberty, Hollywood, California, Silicon Valley, the Grand Canyon. These are all famous, amazing parts of America. Guns, presidents. Abraham Lincoln usually gets mentioned. Some of these things are not positive things. There's a mixture of things. Somebody usually says hamburgers. So it's not like you get to choose necessarily what your country, how other people perceive your country. So we are going to, look at it from a variety of perspectives. I'm Canadian, as I said, so I'm going to try and talk about what Americans usually think about themselves, and what international communities think about them, and what Asia looks at America, what they perceive of America, and these perceptions change over time. People are not as excited about moving to America currently as they have been. There's a lot of it's very tumultuous there. There's a coronavirus thing. There's all these political, there's all this political tension as we approach the election in the United States. There's a lot of violence. There's protesting. There's racism. These are not necessarily the best look for the United States internationally. I think there's a lot of people in America itself that are sort of sick of all the instability. So we got to talk about things, in their time, in their location, and from a certain perspective. I'm going to save that for next lecture, though, because I want to talk about today the concept of dominant versus sub versus counterculture. So in your textbook there, we're going to just skip ahead really quick to page 42. And if you look in page 42, you'll see exactly what I just said. It's called Cultural Dynamics. That's the header. And there's 3 short sections: dominant culture, counterculture, and subculture. And this is just one way, among other ways, that we're going to look at each stage or area of culture that we talk about. So one of the things what we're going to talk about first is that we try to understand culture in terms of its context, right? So when we're talking about the first culture, the first groups of people that occupied the British Isles that we have any good information about, we're going to be talking about the Celtic people. And the Celtic people are, their culture is more closely related to the Welsh and the Irish and certain groups of people in Northern Europe that those cultures still exist, and they're very famous and very, very popular. What a lot of people don't know, who aren't British or American or Canadian, is that Celtic culture was widespread, and that the entire, northwest of Europe was generally linked by these similarities that Celtic people share. So at the beginning of this whole course, what culture is dominant? The Celts. The Celtic people are dominant. So, and they have a large population, and they have certain habits, lifestyles, language, behaviors, buildings. They make certain products, they consume certain things, and these aspects we're going to talk about as the Celtic people come into contact with the Roman people, and through the efforts of Julius Caesar and his successors, the Romans conquer most of the Celtic world, which is what is modern France, Belgium, the Netherlands, West Germany, northern Spain, and the British Isles. They never get to Ireland, but this whole enormous area that was occupied by a certain culture called the Celtic culture becomes, at first, it's dominant, then it becomes dominated by the Roman invasion, and then they fight back against the domination of the Romans, but the Romans gradually convert them, transform them, merge with the local culture, and the Roman way, the Roman language, and the Roman system becomes dominant, and the counter culture, the rebellious resistance of the Celts subsides. It diminishes, and they become sort of Romanized. And when they get to that point, the Celtic culture becomes a subculture. Now, what's the difference between a subculture and a counterculture? Sometimes very little. A subculture could be suddenly transformed into a counterculture. I'm not going to try not to give too many examples in our current life that are political. But if a group of people has a reason to resist, and the dominant culture begins to, for example, take away their rights or threaten them, that culture that is a subculture might decide to rise up and might suddenly become active, right? So the Celtic culture, that's sort of what happened. They sort of, especially the leaders, sort of merged and became Roman in their dress and their manners and their behavior and the things that they consume and the way that they appeared. And even though the Romans were there for hundreds of years, eventually the Romans lost control of Northern Europe and withdrew their forces back to Italy, all the way back, eventually all the way back to Italy as the Roman Empire collapsed. And then there was no Roman influence in the United Kingdom or the British Isles anymore. And then the Celtic culture reasserted itself. Suddenly, when there was no Romans around, and there were Germanic invasions, and a different kind of dynamic appeared. So this is the kind of thing we need to talk about. Celtic culture is still very important. It's still one of the roots of all of the people from the British Isles. It's one of the things that links all of them together, is this Celtic heritage. So it doesn't matter if you get a gene test, a genetic test, and you're like 20% German and 5% Italian and 50% Celtic or Welsh or Scottish. You can get this information now. Your composition, your genetic composition could be 10 different countries, but you are British, you're English, and your ancestors have lived there for hundreds and hundreds of years. And you didn't ever really travel very far until globalization occurred. But that heritage and that sense of identity is still there. And some of the things are very simple. It's just the artwork, the design of the buildings. When you go into a pub, the style of the door and the signs and the scripts, and perhaps even the words and the accents have some roots in Irish language or Scottish language, or Gaelic is the language of the British Isles that the Celts used. So all these things you may not be aware of, but if you're British, you're part Celtic, because that culture it was suppressed, and it was sort of marginalized for hundreds of years. But it never disappeared. It reasserted itself the instant the dominant culture released the pressure and started to withdraw. It blossomed again, and there's a Celtic Renaissance really in the first millennium as well, as the Irish people joined the Catholic Church and started making beautiful artwork and religious texts and doing missions to other parts of Europe. So this is really the beginning of the story. So this lecture today is going to be called "In the Beginning," and the next lecture this week is going to be called "The First Millennium." So you might be wondering, I've gotten to this point. I'm going to try and keep the lectures between 25 and 30 minutes. So we're creeping up on 25 minutes here. This is my Raptors shirt, Toronto Raptors. This is a little piece of Canadian culture that I decided to wear on purpose today. It's because the basketball team, represented by this symbol in this shirt, won their game yesterday and tied the series at 2-2. This is not related to the course. That's why I saved it for right now. But when you wear things, and I do have this conversation with my students at Chungnam a lot, because most of them are Asian, not all of them, but they have a tendency to wear things and not have any idea what they mean. And I honestly can tell you, I've never worn a shirt that I didn't really know what it meant since I was a kid. But I did. When I came to Korea, I bought this jacket and I just thought it was cool and I didn't really care what was on it. I went back to Canada and the first thing that one of my friends said to me is, "What does that say on your jacket?" And I said, "I don't know. What does it say?" And on the back, it said, "Dream a cool dream." And my friends thought it was hilarious. They had no idea what it meant. I had no idea what it meant. Dream a cool dream? Why? What is a cool dream? Does that mean I'm dreaming about a job or a future or a romantic interest? No, nobody could figure it out, and they thought it was so funny, and I was embarrassed. But nobody has ever commented on what was on my shirt in Korea, and sometimes they don't even care. But you know what? It does mean something. There's a basketball here, and there's a raptor claw, and it does say Toronto, which is not where I'm from exactly, but I always tell people in Korea I'm from Toronto. So what am I representing here? I'm representing Canadian culture. There is only one basketball team in all of Canada, just like baseball. So you may know the Blue Jays because of Liu Hyunjin. He's a baseball player, professional left-handed pitcher. He plays for the Blue Jays, and I was thrilled to hear that he was traded to the Blue Jays because that is the team I cheer for, and I now can cheer for a Korean player on a Canadian baseball team. These are things that are representations of culture. So we're going to eventually look at sports, but sports is just one facet of American and British culture that is very influential, right? We're going to talk about all the things. The Industrial Revolution. We're going to talk about the American Civil War. We're going to talk about the War of Independence. We're going to talk about the Norman invasion, the Roman occupation, the Vikings, and everything else. And all of these things have their impact. And together they contribute to the thing that we call British and American culture. And the process of creating this thing, I call it evolution and revolution. So I look forward to talking to you next class about the specifics. For now, page 42, take a look at that. Read over the introduction. The introduction contains a few examples of just things I just chose that you might be familiar with or not, but really sort of connect with, a continuum of culture. Some things connect not just now or then, but everything. When we get to Shakespeare, I'm probably going to go on and on about this. That's one of the beautiful things about Shakespeare and why he's a great example of British culture is because he does have historical plays. He has comedies and tragedies, historical plays. There's romance. There's everything. There's something for everyone. And he really had his finger on the heartbeat of Elizabethan culture. So it's located in the 16th century and the early 17th century. But Shakespeare is for all seasons. As Ben Jonson said in his eulogy for Shakespeare, those are plays. He's a man for all seasons. You have your Greek and ancient Rome characters, your plays about Julius Caesar, and then you have your history plays like, the Richard III and Henry V. And all those great plays, right up to Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet in the Renaissance. And when you read those plays, you get the sense that you're reading and understanding something that's connecting to human nature and all human culture, but it's specifically English. It's especially English. And that's, I think, what we want to do here. We want to talk about all the things. Some of the things will be very familiar, like basketball and sports. These are things that everybody has in their culture and some people enjoy to a greater or lesser extent, but that British and American people contributed in a certain way, a type of culture that can still be identified as coming from America or from the United Kingdom. So the British Empire even. That is all for today. We're at the 30-minute mark. I will be posting another lecture on Thursday, which will be part 2 of this week. Thank you for listening to the beginning. And next lecture, we'll talk about the first millennium. Okay, make sure you watch this in your own time, but at least by Sunday. That's the deadline. Have a great day. Be careful in the typhoon. I'll talk to you again soon.